What if Jimmy Carter won re-election in 1980? What if the trajectory of American history had shifted in 1980? What if Jimmy Carter, beset by economic woes, the Iran hostage crisis, and conservative opposition, had beaten the odds and secured a second term in the White House? In this video, we explore an alternate timeline where Carter wins re-election, examining the domestic and global consequences of that victory. Through this speculative lens, we will delve into the critical what-ifs that can inspire thoughtful debate among political scholars. The 1980 presidential election was set against a backdrop of national discontent. As the incumbent, Jimmy Carter endured collapsing public trust due to a stalled economy marked by high inflation and unemployment, what became known as stagflation. Compounding these challenges was the Iran hostage crisis, with 52 American diplomats held captive for over a year, casting a shadow of vulnerability over his administration. The national mood was bleak, and many saw Carter as an ineffective leader. On the other side stood Ronald Reagan, a charismatic former California governor and the face of a rising conservative movement. Reagan's optimism, strong rhetoric on national security, and promises of economic renewal galvanized a growing segment of the American electorate. Victory seemed inevitable for Reagan. But what if the narrative had changed? Suppose the hostage crisis had ended in Carter's favor just weeks before the election, or his economic measures had begun to bear fruit. Let's dive into the implications, looking first at what a second Carter term might have meant for domestic policy. If Jimmy Carter had won re-election, he would have doubled down on many of the priorities from his first term, charting a very different course for the 1980s. One of the most intriguing possibilities is the impact on energy policy. Carter's presidency emphasized breaking America's dependence on foreign oil. He famously installed solar panels on the White House and championed renewable energy long before the climate crisis entered the mainstream political discourse. A second term could have accelerated the U.S. transition to renewable energy sources, potentially positioning the nation as a global leader in combating climate change. Imagine an America where investments in wind and solar began in earnest in the early 1980s, reducing fossil fuel reliance decades earlier. Would this early pivot to sustainable energy have prevented some of the disastrous environmental consequences we face today? Or would corporate and political resistance have stymied Carter's efforts? This is one of the key questions scholars could debate. Carter's handling of the economy would have taken a vastly different direction compared to Reagan's tax cuts and deregulation. His administration was focused on combating inflation through conservative monetary policies, even at the expense of short-term economic growth. Without Reaganomics, a pivotal policy shift that arguably widened the wealth gap in America, would income inequality and economic disparity have developed on the same scale? Carter's second term may have seen advancements in social welfare, particularly in healthcare. While he was unable to achieve significant healthcare reform during his first term, a revitalized administration might have laid the foundation for nationalized healthcare. This would predate Bill Clinton's and Barack Obama's efforts by decades. Might a more immediate focus on healthcare reform under Carter have prevented later partisan gridlock on the issue? Or would fierce Republican opposition have limited his scope for change? One of the most significant domestic ramifications of Carter's re-election would have been curtailing the rise of conservatism spearheaded by Ronald Reagan. Reagan's policies on abortion, education, and the economy marked a decisive cultural shift in America. If Carter had delayed this Reagan revolution, would the conservative movement have lost momentum? Or would it have re-emerged more forcefully in the late 1980s? Carter's foreign policy philosophy centered on diplomacy, human rights, and peaceful negotiation. A second term would have prolonged this approach, likely steering U.S. foreign relations in a more restrained, less militaristic direction. Undoubtedly, Carter's legacy is heavily tied to the Iran hostage crisis, which proved to be a significant factor in his 1980 defeat. In an alternate timeline, where he wins re-election, it's plausible that the hostages were freed before the election, boosting his credibility as a resolute, patient leader. The question becomes, how would Carter's restrained, diplomatic approach to Iran influence U.S. Middle East relations in subsequent decades? Would it reduce the likelihood of future conflicts in the region, Or would perceived weakness embolden adversaries, as his critics claimed? Carter's emphasis on human rights as a cornerstone of diplomacy stood in stark contrast to Reagan's hardline stance against communism. In Carter's second term, the focus likely would have remained on negotiation and containment instead of military buildups. This raises speculative but rich questions. Could Carter's approach have delayed the fall of the Soviet Union, altering one of the defining geopolitical shifts of the 20th century? Or might his strategies have brought about a transformation in US-Soviet relations faster and without the same level of confrontation? Carter's relative restraint in Latin America might have continued unchanged, avoiding the extensive covert interventions typical of the Reagan administration. His commitment to fostering democracies in the global South rather than forcibly opposing leftist movements may have led to a less tumultuous period in US-Latin America relations. The absence of Ronald Reagan in 1980 is one of the most compelling elements in this thought experiment, with potentially far-reaching ripple effects for US culture, politics, and even the global order. Without Reagan winning in 1980, the conservative movement, especially the religious right, might have struggled to cement its influence. Reagan's presidency galvanized this faction, elevating issues such as abortion, school prayer, and family values into national debates. Carter's continued presence in the White House may have delayed or diminished the ascent of cultural conservatism. However, one could also argue that the movement's momentum was too strong to be derailed. Would a different leader, perhaps Reagan himself in 1984, have reignited the movement with equal or greater force? The absence of Reagan's economic policies raises several questions. Without sweeping tax cuts for the wealthy, would middle-class prosperity have grown under Carter, laying a foundation for a less economically polarized society? Alternatively, would Carter's more cautious, incremental approach to economic recovery have left him vulnerable to criticism, opening the door for Republicans in 1984? Reagan's presidency arguably accelerated the ideological divide between conservatives and liberals, a division that continues to shape American politics today. Could Carter, with his centrist leanings, have forestalled this polarization? Or would his presidency have inadvertently fueled resentment among conservatives, prompting an even sharper ideological rift later on? Beyond policy, Carter's win would have had cultural and societal effects, influencing how Americans perceived their leadership and reshaping the national character in subtle yet profound ways. Reagan's Hollywood charisma and masterful use of media transformed the presidency into a platform for optimistic storytelling. Carter, in contrast, often spoke of hard truths and moral leadership. A second term might have reinforced a more serious, reflective tone in American media and political discourse. Would this have created a stronger tradition of accountable leadership, or would it have left Americans yearning for Reagan's sunny optimism? Carter's proactive leadership on environmental issues could have forged earlier alliances between the government and private sectors to confront emerging ecological challenges. It's tantalizing to imagine a 1980s where environmental protection was a national priority. However, such efforts would have been met with heavy resistance from entrenched industries. Would a second Carter term have succeeded in making sustainability a cultural norm? Or would these initiatives have been relegated to the margins as they were during his first presidency? Carter's commitment to civil rights was evident in his efforts to diversify appointments and prioritize equal opportunities. In a second term, he might have expanded initiatives for racial and gender equity. Would this have inspired a stronger second wave of the civil rights movement, or would it have been stymied by opposition? Speculating on Carter's re-election raises a host of fascinating questions. For instance, would Carter, faced with relentless opposition in Congress, have been able to implement his agenda effectively? How would global relations have shifted without Reagan's famous peace through strength doctrine? What role would Ronald Reagan have played post-1980? Would his political career have ended with his defeat, or would he have returned as a force in a later election cycle? The question of, what if Jimmy Carter won re-election in 1980, is not simply a thought experiment. It forces us to reflect deeply on the fragile, contingent nature of history. One election fundamentally altered the direction of American politics, economy, and society. How might one decision, or one shift in public opinion, have extended Carter's legacy and changed our world today? As political scholars, such counterfactual scenarios offer fertile ground to explore questions of leadership, timing, and the interplay between destiny and choice. Carter's values of diplomacy, environmental consciousness, and human rights provide enduring lessons worth debating, even in an alternate past. So, what do you think? Would Jimmy Carter's second term have transformed the nation for the better? Or was his presidency destined to fall short in the face of immense challenges? The answer lies not in clear conclusions, but in the discussion sparked by imagining what might have been. Like and subscribe for more from History Twist.